My name is Eloise Riley. I am 28 years old. My parents banned me from my sister's wedding at the Four Seasons in Boston and told 400 guests I was mentally unstable, all while they quietly forged my signature on a medical power of attorney to seize the Beacon Hill estate my grandmother left me. A betrayal they executed while I was leading a logistics unit in Jordan, proving that to them, my 10 years of service as a captain in the United States Army meant less than the property taxes on a house they didn't own. Take a second to like and subscribe, because the reason my sister started screaming in the middle of her reception is tucked inside a silver box that contains the one thing my parents thought I'd never find. I stood in the center of that marble lobby, feeling the weight of the Boston humidity and the even heavier weight of 400 sets of eyes I knew were judging a version of me that didn't exist. The air in the Four Seasons smelled of expensive lilies and the kind of filtered oxygen only the wealthy seemed to breathe, a sharp contrast to the dust and diesel I had inhaled for the last 12 months. Behind the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, a string quartet was playing a softened version of something classical, and I could hear the rhythmic clinking of crystal as the city's elite toasted to a union built on a foundation of lies. The two women at the check-in desk were younger than me, dressed in sharp black blazers, their eyes scanning the thick, cream-colored pages of the guest list with a clinical coldness that I recognized from my time in officer candidate school. I had already given my name twice, and I saw the way they looked at each other. That quick, flickering glance of pity that people give to someone they think is broken. One of them, a girl with perfectly manicured nails, wouldn't look me in the eye when she told me, in a voice as soft as a funeral director's, that there was no Eloise Riley on the list. She explained that she had been instructed by my mother, Lydia Riley, that if I showed up, I was to be guided quietly to a side exit and told that medical professionals were on standby to take me home. I didn't yell, and I didn't cause the scene they were clearly expecting from a disturbed veteran. Instead, I simply pulled out my phone and dialed my sister's number. My sister, Sloane Riley, answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear the high-pitched hum of her bridesmaids laughing in the background, the sound of champagne corks popping, the sounds of a life I was never allowed to touch. I told her I was in the lobby and that the staff was treating me like a liability, asking her exactly what she had told them to make them look at me with such hollow sympathy. The silence on the other end was brittle, and when my sister finally spoke, the warmth she'd been using for her guests vanished into something sharp and defensive. She told me I shouldn't have come, and that the family had agreed it was an intimate ceremony. But more importantly, she said that after what our parents told the Brooks family about my condition, they didn't think I'd even be capable of making the flight from Fort Liberty. I asked her what condition she was referring to, and that my mother had an evaluation from a doctor in Virginia stating I wasn't fit to manage my own affairs, let alone attend a high society wedding where I would be an embarrassment to her new husband's reputation. She told me to leave the gift and go back to the base before security had to get involved, hanging up before I could tell her that the doctor she mentioned hadn't seen me since I was a child. I stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the wedding muffled by the heavy doors, feeling that familiar cold weight in my chest that had defined my entire childhood in our Beacon Hill brownstone. It was the feeling of being invisible in my own home. The daughter who was sent to West Point because my parents didn't know what else to do with a child who didn't fit their social mold. I looked down at the silver box in my hands. It wasn't a homemade photo album or a piece of Army memorabilia like they expected. Inside that box was the end of the Riley family's social standing, containing a copy of a legal filing that was currently sitting on the desk of a federal prosecutor. I walked over to the gift table, which was a mountain of white ribbon and designer labels, and placed my small, unassuming box right at the front, tucked between a Tiffany crystal bowl and an Hermes package. I tucked the card under the ribbon, addressed to my sister for the life she thought she'd earned, from the siblings she tried to erase. The receptionist watched me, her hand hovering over a radio, ready to call security, but I gave her a small, tight smile, the kind you give an enemy when you know their supply lines have already been cut. I told her I was leaving, but to make sure the bride opened that one personally, because it was the only thing on the table that was actually hers. I turned and walked out of the Four Seasons, out into the sharp Boston autumn air, knowing that while I had a flight to catch, my mother had a deposition to prepare for, even if she didn't know it yet. Because to understand why I was standing there, I have to take you back to the day the silence in our house became a wall I couldn't climb over. I grew up in a 4-story federal-style brownstone in Beacon Hill, the kind of house that appeared on historical tours and in the background of New England architectural magazines, where everything was polished and nothing was real. Inside those walls, there were 2 daughters, but only one who mattered to the narrative my mother was writing for the Boston social scene. My sister, Sloane, was 3 years older, and she was the sun that the rest of the family orbited around. She had the larger bedroom overlooking the common, the private school tuition that was never questioned, and the debutante preparation that began before she could even drive. I was the shadow, the quiet second child who filled the gaps in the conversation, the one who wore the hand-me-down sweaters and learned early on that my role was to be as invisible as the domestic staff who moved like clockwork through our hallways. My 10th birthday was the moment I realized that my presence in that family wasn't a joy, but a logistical afterthought that they frequently forgot to manage. I had been counting down the days until I reached double digits, imagining a cake from the flour bakery and maybe a party at the Museum of Science, like the one my sister had been given when she turned 10. That morning, I walked into the kitchen and found my mother huddled over a stack of Tiffany invitations for my sister's upcoming Junior League gala, her pen moving with a frantic energy that left no room for me. My father was already gone, likely in his office at the financial district, dealing with billable hours that were worth more than my childhood milestones. And when I stood there and whispered that it was my birthday, my mother didn't even look up from her calligraphy. She simply told me she knew and that we would do something later. But later never arrived, and I spent the afternoon sitting on the back stairs listening to the sounds of a house that was too busy celebrating its own image to notice I was turning 10 years old. If you've ever sat at a dinner table and realized that your own parents were looking right through you like you didn't even exist, tell me how you found your way out. Like and subscribe. Because the only person who saw me that day was about to give me the only piece of truth I had to hold on to for the next 18 years. The only person who remembered was my grandmother, Nora, who arrived that evening while the rest of the house was quiet, smelling of lavender and old books, and carrying a small, heavy box wrapped in simple brown paper. She sat on the edge of my bed and didn't apologize for my parents' neglect, because she knew that a hollow apology would only emphasize the wound. So she instead handed me the box and told me that a woman needs to know exactly where she stands, even when the world is trying to move the ground beneath her. Inside was a Luminox field watch, a sturdy piece of Swiss engineering with a black strap and a face that glowed in the dark, a tool designed for someone who needed to track time in the harshest conditions. She told me I had a steady hand and a mind that understood the mechanics of how things worked, and that while the rest of the family was chasing the light, I was the one who knew how to navigate the dark. I didn't know then that this watch would be the first piece of my future, or that my grandmother was already planning a way to protect me from the people who were supposed to love me. 8 years later, I stood in that same hallway in my West Point uniform, having earned a full appointment to the United States Military Academy, a feat that required more discipline and intelligence than anything my sister had ever accomplished. I thought that maybe, finally, as a cadet, I would see a flicker of pride in my father's eyes, some recognition that I was the first member of the Riley family to serve in a century. The ceremony was on a Saturday afternoon at West Point, and I had been selected for a leadership award in tactical logistics, a recognition of my ability to manage complex systems under pressure. The morning of my commissioning, I came downstairs in my dress whites, the fabric crisp and the brass polished until it caught the morning sun through the windows. My sister was at the kitchen table, about a smudge on her Prada heels, while my parents were arguing about the seasonal guest list for their house in the Berkshires. When I told them we needed to leave by 7 to make the drive upstate to the Hudson Valley, my father finally looked at me. But his expression wasn't one of pride. It was one of deep, simmering annoyance. He told me that something had come up, that my sister had an emergency meeting with a political consultant in D.C. that could launch her career as a lobbyist, and they couldn't possibly miss the opportunity to network with the people who ran the Hill. I stood there in my uniform, clutching my commissioning papers, and reminded them that I was becoming an officer in the United States Army, that I was graduating from one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. My mother didn't even stop scrolling through her phone when she told me that the military wasn't a real career for a woman of my standing, and that maybe I should have stayed in Boston and gone to HBS like they'd suggested. She said my sister's future was a priority because she was building something that would last, while I was just playing at being a soldier in a world that didn't care about my last name. I walked to that ceremony alone, driving my old Jeep up the Taconic State Parkway while the tears blurred my vision. And I sat through the graduation among hundreds of families who were cheering until their voices broke. When they called my name and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I looked out at the sea of faces and saw only one person standing in the front row, clapping with a ferocity that made my chest ache. My grandmother, Nora, who had driven herself from Beacon Hill just to see me take my oath. Afterward, she held my hands in hers and told me that the greatest power isn't in the titles people give you, but in the secrets you keep until the moment they are needed most. I didn't understand what she meant then, as I prepared for my first deployment as a second lieutenant, but I would understand it perfectly 6 years later, when I was standing in the Middle East and received the news that she was gone. Her death was the catalyst that finally stripped the mask off my parents' faces, revealing that their neglect wasn't just passive, it was calculated, and it was about to become criminal. I was back on emergency leave from Jordan, standing in the freezing rain outside King's Chapel in Boston, feeling the heavy wool of my dress blues soak through as I watched my parents perform the role of grieving heirs for a woman they had spent decades trying to ignore. My mother, Lydia, stood at the center of a circle of old money socialites, her face hidden behind a designer lace veil, dabbing at eyes that I knew were already dry, and calculating the market value of the Beacon Hill brownstone. My father stood beside her, his hand resting on my sister's shoulder in a gesture of protection he had never once offered me, while the guests whispered about the tragic loss of a Riley matriarch and the impressive inheritance that would surely follow. I stood 10 feet away, a stranger in my own family's mourning ritual, realizing that even in death, my grandmother's love for me was being treated as a logistical error that my parents were desperate to correct. The real blow didn't land until 2 days later, when I was summoned to my father's private study, a room filled with the scent of expensive bourbon and the heavy, suffocating silence of unspoken resentment. My father, Arthur, didn't offer me a seat or a word of comfort. Instead, he slid a folder across the mahogany desk and told me that the estate had reached a complicated stage due to my deployment status and the perceived instability of my life in the Army. I opened the folder and felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at a medical power of attorney document dated 3 months prior, which bore a signature that looked exactly like mine, but had been inked while I was 4,000 miles away in a logistics hub. Standing there in that dimly lit study, holding the legal document where my own mother had mimicked my handwriting to claim I was suffering from PTSD-induced psychosis, just so they could seize the Berkshire estate while I was literally guarding their freedom. If you've ever had your own blood use your sacrifice as a reason to bury you, tell me your story in the comments, like and subscribe. Because what I found on the next page of that file made the forgery look like an act of mercy. I looked at my mother, who was sitting on the velvet sofa by the window, her expression as cold and immovable as the granite of the Massachusetts coastline. And I asked her how she could possibly justify claiming I was mentally unfit to handle my own life. She didn't flinch or apologize. She simply stated that a girl in my position, a woman who spent her time in combat zones instead of boardrooms, didn't understand the nuance of family legacy or the importance of keeping our assets consolidated under my sister's future. She told me that Sloane needed the Berkshire property to secure her standing with the Brooks family, and that my grandmother's decision to leave the house to me was a symptom of old age and a misguided attempt to reward a daughter who had abandoned the family for a uniform. My mother actually had the audacity to suggest that by declaring me incapacitated, they were doing me a favor, protecting me from the burden of an inheritance I was too damaged to enjoy. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was cleaner and sharper than anything I had experienced in training. A cold clarity that told me my parents hadn't just forgotten me. They had identified me as a threat to their financial security. They had spent my entire deployment coordinating with a family friend in probate court, spinning a narrative of a broken soldier who was too unstable to handle a real estate portfolio, all to ensure that every cent of my grandmother's hard-earned preservation work was funneled into my sister's lobbying career. My father sat there and told me, with the same flat voice he used for corporate litigation, that if I fought them, they would use my military records and the trauma of my service to make the declaration permanent in the eyes of the Army. I realized then that the only reason they had invited me back for the funeral was to get me to sign the final waivers, thinking that the fragile daughter they had invented would be too gutted by grief to see the trap they had set. They didn't realize that the captain who stood before them had spent 10 years learning how to identify hostile movements and secure supply lines, and that I had already made a copy of the forged document with my phone before I even sat down. I looked at the parents who were willing to destroy my reputation and my career to pay for my sister's designer wedding and her corporate ambitions, and I felt the last shred of my childhood loyalty dissolve into a quiet, focused rage. I told them that I wouldn't be signing anything today, and as I walked out of that study, I could hear my mother's voice rising in a sharp, panicked command for me to come back and be reasonable for the sake of the family name. I didn't stop until I reached my Jeep, knowing that the next call I made wouldn't be to a family member, but to a JAG officer who specialized in civilian fraud, because the logistics of this betrayal were about to become their worst nightmare. I drove north, leaving the jagged skyline of Boston behind for the quiet, muted colors of the Berkshires, where the Riley family had spent every summer pretending to be happy, while the rot grew beneath the floorboards of our shingle-style cottage. The house sat on 20 acres of prime Massachusetts timberland, a property my grandmother had fought to keep out of my father's hands for 40 years, because she knew he would sell it to cover his billable hours before the ink on her death certificate was dry. I pulled into the gravel driveway and sat in the silence of my Jeep, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I looked at the porch where I had spent my childhood summers being invisible, a ghost in a sundress, while my sister was coached on how to charm the sons of senators. I walked up the steps, the wood groaning under my boots, and I used the key my grandmother had hidden inside a hollowed-out granite stone by the garden gate, a secret she had shared with me during my last R&R before I deployed to Jordan. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and the lingering scent of my grandmother's Darjeeling tea, a comfort that felt like a physical blow to my chest as I moved through the darkened hallway toward her private library. I didn't need a map to find what I was looking for. I had spent a lifetime observing the small details my parents ignored, and I knew that the loose floorboard under the Persian rug wasn't a defect, but a vault. I knelt on the cold hardwood and pulled back the heavy wool, prying up the board to reveal a small, silver box with a tarnished lid, the very same one I would later place on my sister's gift table at the Four Seasons. I sat on the floor and opened it, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with the cold realization that my grandmother had anticipated every move my parents would make while I was overseas. Inside the box sat a thick envelope of legal-grade vellum and a series of notarized affidavits that laid out the logistics of a betrayal more complex than any supply chain I had ever managed in the Middle East. There was a letter, handwritten in my grandmother's elegant, sharp script, dated only weeks before her passing, addressed to me as Captain Eloise Riley, a title my parents refused to acknowledge even in their holiday cards. She wrote that she had seen my mother, Lydia, moving money between the family trust and my sister's failing lobbying firm, using my name as a guarantor because they assumed I was too occupied with the military to ever check my credit report. My grandmother had quietly spent her final months gathering the bank statements and the forged signatures, creating a paper trail that proved my parents had embezzled over $400,000 from my own savings accounts to pay for my sister's Manhattan apartment and her designer wedding dress. I kept thinking about the thousands of miles I had traveled to protect a country that included people like them. People who saw my service as a convenient distraction that allowed them to pick my pockets while I was looking for IEDs. My grandmother's letter was clear. She hadn't just left me the Berkshire cottage. She had left me the power to dismantle the facade they had built over 30 years of social climbing. She told me that she had left a second box, the gift, that was to be opened only when the family was gathered, a final tactical strike designed to force them to look at the daughter they had tried to erase. I realized then that my grandmother didn't want me to just survive their cruelty. She wanted me to execute a reassignment of the family's future, ensuring that the Riley name actually stood for something other than theft and social posturing. I sat in that quiet library for hours, the shadows lengthening across the mahogany shelves, and I felt the last of my gutted childhood hope finally die, replaced by a cold, officer's precision that told me exactly how to proceed. I wasn't just a victim of a probate scam. I was a logistics specialist who had just discovered a massive leak in the family trust, and I knew that if I didn't plug it now, they would continue to bleed me dry until there was nothing left but a discharge paper and a pile of debt. I tucked the silver box into my bag, locking the cottage behind me, and I felt a strange sense of peace as I drove back toward Logan Airport to return to my unit. I knew that the next time I saw my parents, it wouldn't be as a daughter looking for approval, but as the woman who held the keys to their social and legal destruction. The flight back to North Carolina felt shorter than usual, my mind already mapping out the contingency plans for the wedding, because I knew that my sister's big day was the only stage large enough for the truth to finally land with the impact it deserved. I spent the next 48 hours at Fort Liberty, surrounded by the comforting, predictable logistics of Army life, where every piece of equipment has a serial number and every person has a rank that actually means something. It was a sharp contrast to the Riley family home, where the rules changed based on my mother's latest social gryly, and where my 10 years of service were treated like a personality flaw that needed to be managed with lies and notarized forgeries. I sat at my desk in the quartermaster office, looking at the silver box that was sitting on top of my tactical gear, and I realized that my parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had tried to steal my sanity by filing that unstable declaration with the Department of Veterans Affairs.
They were so desperate to secure my sister's corporate future that they were willing to let a captain's career end in a dishonorable discharge just to keep me from questioning the ledger of their own failures. My father had the audacity to call me one last time, his voice thick with the condescension of a man who spent his life measuring worth in billable hours, telling me that for the safety of the guests, I should stay in North Carolina and focus on my recovery. I didn't argue with him. I just let the silence stretch across the line until he hung up. Because I knew that the manifest for my trip back to Boston was already locked and the silver box was already packed. I booked a room at a small, unassuming Marriott near Long Wharf, avoiding the high society hotels where my mother's name still carried enough weight to have me followed by private security. On the morning of the wedding, I didn't reach for my dress blues. Instead, I chose a simple, elegant navy dress that my grandmother had bought me before her final illness. A dress that made me feel like the woman she saw, not the soldier my parents feared. I checked the contents of the box one last time. The forged POA, the bank statements proving the embezzlement, and the Berkshire deed, and I felt a cold, professional focus that I usually reserved for high-stakes deployment rotations. The valet took my keys at the entrance of the Four Seasons, and as I looked at that small silver box sitting on the passenger seat, the one that would either set me free or incinerate my entire family's reputation in front of 400 of Boston's elite. If you think you know which one I picked, drop a yes or no in the comments. Like and subscribe. Because I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 20 minutes, and I almost chose to drive away and never look back. I chose to walk in, not because I wanted to hurt my sister, but because I was tired of being the only person in the room who was carrying the weight of the truth while everyone else toasted to a mirage. I walked past the federal-style floral arrangements and the string quartet, my heels clicking on the marble with a rhythm that felt like a countdown to a tactical strike they never saw coming. When I reached the reception table and saw the look of sheer, panicked pity on the staff's faces, I realized my mother had done exactly what she threatened. She had pre-briefed the entire hotel staff on my breakdown. The girl behind the guest list looked at me like I was a ticking clock, her hand hovering near the phone as she told me that my name had been highlighted in red as a restricted individual who was not to be granted entry under any circumstances. I didn't beg her to let me in,
And I didn't try to explain that I had managed more personnel in Jordan than this entire hotel had on staff. I simply asked to see the gift coordinator. My sister, Sloane Riley, had apparently hired an entire team just to manage the intake of designer boxes and monetary envelopes, ensuring that every tribute was logged before the first course of lobster bisque was served. I watched as the coordinator took the silver box, her eyes darting to the name on the card. From your sister, Eloise. And I saw her hesitate, likely remembering the instructions my mother had given about refusing anything from the troubled daughter. I told her, with the quiet authority of a captain, that she should place it at the very front of the table because it contained the Riley family's most important historical records, and that my sister was expecting it. I turned and walked toward the elevators, my mission of delivery complete, knowing that while they were currently celebrating my absence, they were about to be blindsided by my presence in a way that no amount of lobbying or social connections could ever fix. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons in Boston was a masterpiece of New England excess, with 400 guests seated under crystal chandeliers that likely cost more than my entire unit's annual budget for logistics management, all while I sat in a terminal at Logan Airport, watching the second hand on my Luminox field watch with the cold precision of a captain waiting for a coordinated strike to land. I sat there in a plastic chair that felt remarkably grounding compared to the suffocating weight of my mother's social register expectations, nursing a lukewarm coffee and imagining the scene 3 miles away, where my sister Sloane was likely radiant in her custom silk gown, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while our mother whispered to the socialites at the head table, reinforcing the lie that I was currently locked away in a psychiatric facility for my own safety. There is a specific kind of quiet that precedes a structural collapse, a moment of false normalcy where the foundations are already compromised, but the inhabitants are still laughing. And that was exactly the atmosphere in that ballroom as the third course was cleared. A truffle risotto that my father had likely billed to my grandmother's medical trust, and the MC took the microphone to announce the opening of select tributes. My sister floated toward the gift table like a queen approaching a throne, her new husband Sterling trailing behind her with the confident smile of a man who thought he had married into a legacy of untouchable Beacon Hill stability, unaware that he was standing on a sinkhole. She picked up the silver box, her eyes scanning the card I had written with the same discipline I used for supply manifest reports, and I could imagine the smug, performative sighs she gave the nearby tables as she prepared to open what she thought was a pathetic token of reconciliation from her troubled sibling. But as she pulled the ribbon and lifted the lid, the air in that ballroom seemed to vanish, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like the pressure in a hazard zone before the alarms go off. Because the first thing she saw wasn't a gift, but a notarized copy of the medical power of attorney my parents had forged while I was overseas. She didn't find a piece of Army memorabilia. She found a formal notice from the district attorney's office regarding an active embezzlement investigation into the family trust, along with a federal prosecutor's summary of how over $400,000 had been diverted from my savings to fund her Manhattan lifestyle. My mother, Lydia, tried to snatch the papers, her face a mask of manicured fury. But it was too late, because my sister had already started to scream. A high, thin sound that cut through the chamber music like a siren and left 400 of Boston's finest frozen over their dessert spoons. She wasn't just crying because her wedding was ruined. She was screaming because she realized that the sister she had spent a decade calling damaged
was the one who had just executed a logistical decapitation of her entire social standing in front of every person who mattered to her. She looked at Sterling and tried to tell him it was a prank, that I was a broken soldier seeking a way to hurt the family, but his face had already shifted into a mask of cold, private equity calculation, as he realized the Brooks family name was now attached to a probate scandal that would be in the Boston Globe by morning. The final blow landed when she reached the bottom of the box and found the disclosure statement for the logistics firm that had moved her entire wedding inventory, the flowers, the chairs, the very floor she was standing on, a company she had praised for its military-grade efficiency just hours before. The document proved that the firm was a subsidiary of the Nora Riley Trust, an entity that I had been managing as the sole director for the last 3 years, while my parents thought I was just pushing paper in a quartermaster office at Fort Liberty. I had quite literally authorized the shipping manifests for her dream wedding, using the very corporate authority they claimed I was too mentally incapacitated to hold, effectively paying for the trucks that delivered her Vera Wang gown while they were busy trying to steal my identity. I sat there in the airport lounge, watching the notifications on my phone begin to vibrate in a steady, frantic rhythm. And I felt a strange, detached peace as I thought about my father sitting at that head table, his billable hours suddenly worth nothing, as he realized he had been caught in a fraud investigation that would lead to his disbarment. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was invisible. They were the ones who were disappearing under the weight of their own criminal arrogance. And as the Brooks family began to stand up and walk away from a union that had just been exposed as a logistical fraud, I realized the gift I had left wasn't just the truth. It was the final inventory of a family that had run out of credit. The scream I could almost hear from 3 miles away wasn't the sound of a broken heart, but the sound of a social register facade finally hitting the ground. And as the gate agent announced that my flight to North Carolina was now boarding, I closed the silver box in my mind and walked toward the jetway, leaving the Riley name behind in the rubble where it belonged. I spent the flight back to North Carolina staring out the window at the absolute darkness over the Appalachian Mountains, watching the wingtip lights flicker against the void as my phone vibrated against my leg with a frantic, rhythmic persistence that felt like a logistical system in total failure. There were 47 missed calls by the time we reached cruising altitude, a desperate manifest of my family's sudden realization that the daughter they had tried to erase was the only one who actually held the keys to their survival. The messages shifted from my sister's sharp, entitled rage, demanding to know how I had dared to ruin her perfect night, to the cold, legalistic threats from my father, Arthur, who was likely already calculating how to bury the forgery evidence before the Brooks family lawyers could tear his social register reputation apart. I sat in the quiet of the cabin and didn't answer a single one, because for 28 years, I had been the one waiting for a return call that never came. And I realized that the silence I was giving them now was the only honest boundary I had left to draw. I felt gutted by the sheer transparency of their betrayal. The fact that my mother, Lydia, had spent my entire deployment in Jordan mimicking my handwriting on a medical power of attorney just so she could pay for a wedding that I wasn't even allowed to attend. By the time I landed at Fort Liberty and walked into the sharp, humid air of the South, the world I had left behind in Boston was already starting to incinerate in the light of the truth I had delivered in that silver box. A video from the reception had gone viral on social media.
Millions of strangers watching my sister Sloane unravel in her custom silk gown, while the guests murmured about the embezzlement and the logistics firm she never knew I owned. My mother arrived at my doorstep 3 days later, looking like a woman who had been stripped of her manicured armor, her Chanel suit wrinkled and her eyes red-rimmed from the realization that the doors of Beacon Hill were finally locking her out. She stood in my living room, looking at the photographs of my unit and the quartermaster commendations on my walls, and she actually started to cry, telling me that she had misunderstood my strength and that she had only been trying to protect the family legacy. I didn't offer her a drink or a seat, and I didn't tell her that it was okay. I simply stood there with the quiet authority of a captain and told her that she hadn't misunderstood anything. She had just miscalculated my silence for weakness. The months that followed were a steady, inevitable inventory of the consequences that my grandmother had set in motion the moment she trusted me with her secrets. My father, Arthur, eventually faced an ethics committee that moved with a speed his billable hours couldn't slow down, resulting in the permanent loss of his law license and a series of civil suits that drained what was left of the family trust. My mother found that her standing on nonprofit boards was as fragile as the lies she had told, and she was forced to move into a small rented townhouse in Marblehead after the Beacon Hill brownstone was seized to cover the restitution costs of the money they had stolen from my grandmother's estate. My sister's marriage to the Brooks family didn't even last the winter, as the annulment was finalized before the wedding gifts were even unpacked. Her husband, realizing that the legacy he thought he was marrying into was nothing but a supply chain of fraud and social desperation. I didn't feel the need for an apology anymore, and I didn't feel the need to explain myself to the people who had tried to declare me mentally unfit just to keep their own heads above water. I received my promotion to major 3 months ago, and I now oversee the entire logistics training cycle at the base, a role that provides a sense of purpose that my family's social climbing never could. I used the money my grandmother had protected for me to buy a small farm in Moore County, a place with a long gravel driveway and a porch where I can sit in the evening and watch the sun go down without checking the manifest of someone else's expectations. My mother and I have started speaking again, but only on the first Sunday of every month, and our conversations are focused on the weather or the house I'm building, the simple, honest things that don't require a notarized signature or a hidden motive. I realized that my parents spent 30 years trying to buy a legacy with money that wasn't theirs, while I spent 10 years earning a life that they will never be able to afford or understand. I looked at my reflection in the mirror this morning while I was pinning my major's oak leaves to my collar, and I realized that I am no longer the girl who was invisible in the hallway of that cold brownstone. I am the woman who knew exactly when to stand her ground and when to walk away. The Luminox watch on my wrist still catches the light just like it did when my grandmother gave it to me, and it reminds me that time is the only currency that really matters. And I'm no longer spending mine on people who only see my worth when they're drowning. I drive my truck down that gravel driveway every evening, the dust settling behind me, and I know that every second of the life I have now is mine because I was brave enough to tell the truth. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and like and subscribe, because there is always someone sitting in their car right now trying to figure out how to stand up to the people who are supposed to love them. And maybe this is the story that helps them decide.